Please don't forget to subscribe. Let's begin. I'm a former private investigator who now blogs on real-life crime. Anonymous papers documenting horrible deeds of psychopathy have been arriving in the mail. I'm not going to reveal my real name to protect my job and the delicate nature of this case. You can address me as Mr. S. if you'd like. When I was a kid, I became a private eye. Although it's not my intention to brag, I was quite good at my profession and soon began taking on higher-paying projects as a freelance private investigator to supplement my income. I've solved a number of high-profile cold murder cases throughout the years. When I was injured in a work-related attack 5 years ago, my career as a private investigator came to an end. Since then, I've created a popular podcast and blog called Real Crime. I've just started receiving handwritten papers from an unnamed source in the mail that describe horrific crimes of dark psychopathy. There's no way to get in touch with you again. The following was written on the outside of the second envelope. For too long, my work has gone unappreciated. It's time for my art to be shown to the world, even if no one understands. Please see below for the second manuscript. It was titled University in this copy. If you haven't already done so, you may check out the first manuscript here. I believe what you are about to read is the book of a psychopath, so proceed with caution. University. My sophomore year of college had just begun. As expected, the past 2 years have been a complete success. My status as a foster child assured that my college tuition was paid for. I had been adopted by Stan and Kelly, and they had welcomed me as their son. So, they gave me a small budget to ensure that my pantry was always stocked and that my basic necessities were taken care of, as well. At least I had all of the technology and supplies I would need to go through my first semester. During the summer and holidays, I always had a place to call home. In order to keep Stan and Kelly bending over themselves for me, I gave them exactly the right amount of engagement and fulfillment. Before Michael, everything was fine. The year before, I had the good pleasure of living with a roommate who didn't say much to each other. We never had a true chat with him because he kept to himself. Actually, I can't remember his name at all. It was just what I needed. Michael, my new roommate this year, was a complete departure from last year's arrangement. A certain type of fool, Michael felt the need to be the focus of attention. My flat was always full of people who couldn't keep their mouths shut for more than 5 seconds at a time. Their conversation, yelling, and blaring terrible pop music was always interrupted by a chorus of musicians who lacked the linguistic skills of first graders. By becoming sloppy drunk and talking about things like bag and hose and the like, Michael and his gang of retards imitated the essence of their favorite tunes. The fact that my generation was so easily swayed by such ridiculous culture horrified me. For a brief while, I believed that they were simply imbibing. In an effort to avoid interacting with the narcissists, I spend most of my time in my room or in the library. However, it didn't take long for me to discover that they were partaking in more than simply alcoholic beverages. Every time Michael came close, I would get a whiff of burnt marijuana, and before long, my entire apartment smelled like it. When I awoke on a Saturday morning to find the wreckage of their Friday night activities, it was even worse than it already was. People I didn't recognize snored like hibernating vermin on the couch and even the floors. The smell of old cigarettes and crunched metal beer cans gave the impression that a swarm of drug addicts had camped out in my apartment. Fine white powder smeared across the coffee table surface, with fingerprints whizzing by. A white paper straw from a fast food restaurant was scattered on the ground. That these snoring doofus were high on cocaine was obvious from their snoring habits. As long as you don't put my health at risk, I don't care if you smoke pot or use cocaine. Michael's arrest for drug possession may theoretically lead to my arrest as well. As the saying goes, you're guilty by association. Obviously, I couldn't take a risk like this that would jeopardize my life and my career. I'd have to talk to Michael about this issue. His room was littered with beer cans that had been kicked around by me as I entered. His bed sat in the middle of his room, which looked like a landfill. Michael was in his underpants and his girlfriend was virtually naked next to him when I pulled back the covers and comforter on the bed. The kid's drug-induced hibernation was not disturbed by ripping off his stinky bedding, so I gave him a nudge. Nothing. But Michael barely awoke when I called out to him, "Michael, wake up and clean this shit up." Each and every second that I had to live in this pigsty made my patience even thinner. I yanked him out of his bed by the foot. In the beginning, his face slammed into the carpet so hard that it seemed to bounce. "Whoa, what the hell are you talking about?" Speaking with some lucidity, Michael chimed in. His fists clenched around his head as he screamed in agony because of the hangover and the head injury. Using his palms, he rubbed his eyelids and tried to open them. "What's the matter, Michael? Get up. Clear your pigsty and get these cretins out of my place. I'd be happy to live in a trailer park full of scumbags if I had the option. You asshole, get the F out of here. Stop acting like a jerk." When he told me, his eyes narrowed and his face appeared to be illuminated by a flashlight. I could see the pain in his eyes, which indicated that he'd had a terrible night of drinking. I was well versed in dealing with a man suffering from a severe hangover. I made my way to the dining room. My old, discolored pot and matching frying pan squeaked open from their tattered storage space in the faded brown kitchen cupboard. I returned to Michael's room, where he was sound asleep in his bed, holding the binoculars by their black plastic handles. In order to avoid stepping on the dirty clothing, I turned on the light. The misaligned blinds' torn white cord allowed the sunlight to flood the room. To protect their eyes from the searing rays, Michael and his girlfriend both reacted by covering their faces with blankets. An increased sensitivity to bright lights and loud noises is a common symptom of a bad hangover. With the pot and pan over Michael's head, I stepped over to his side of the bed and began pounding them together as loudly as possible. When the clang sounded, Michael's reaction was as if he were being attacked by the sun, indicating that the sound was painful to him. The pain he was experiencing in his dehydrated and drunken brain was excruciating, and I relished seeing his reactions to it. He writhed and shrieked like a maniac, yelling obscenities barely heard above the din of my pots and pans. Eventually, the noise and discomfort became intolerable. Michael sprang to his feet and flung off his blankets. To show that he was still intoxicated, he took a stumbling step backwards. Wounded, he acted like an animal with only one objective in mind: to end the suffering. Michael threw a joke of a punch at me, and the expected physical aggression emerged from him as he threw it. I used the pan to swat his hand away. His fists slammed into metal, producing a dull clang. Michael screamed out in pain. First time, it didn't work, so he tried again with the same outcome. This time, he was thrown to the ground, his face slamming against his wounded knuckles as he lost his footing. Clashing skillet and pot over his head once more just infuriated him. I kicked him with a push kick, sending him flying backwards into his cheap black nightstand as he scrambled to his feet. Even though I suspected Michael was a want-to-be mobster, I had no idea what he was going to do next. Michael sprang to his feet and drew a revolver from a drawer in his nightstand, which he pointed straight at my head before closing the drawer. Without further ado, I put down the pot and pan. Michael stood there, his face hot from wrath and pain, with his finger on the trigger of the rifle in his trembling palm. As a parent, I had no doubt that Michael would maintain a gun loaded and ready to shoot me in the head if he pulled the trigger. It took us a moment to get used to each other as we stood there, staring at the barrel and slide in quiet. As Michael recognized the seriousness of the situation, his face softened slightly. I could see in his eyes that he understood that if he pulled the trigger, he would spend the rest of his life in prison. Everyone in the flat had woken up and realized what was going on by this point. Their circus leader had just pulled a gun on them, and they were unsure what to do as they stood awkwardly outside the bedroom door. Every fiber of my being yearned for me to snatch his weapon from his cold, dead hands and shoot him then and then. If you know what you're doing, it's a really simple maneuver to pull off in this situation. It's possible that I was within my legal rights to do so, but I didn't want my name on a police record or to spend time in a courtroom. I didn't want to draw attention to myself, especially not in front of law enforcement. So I decided to take a more diplomatic route. In order to avoid causing an irrational reaction from the man who had a gun, I calmly but assertively informed him, "I don't care what you do with your own life, but it's not acceptable for you to endanger my future. You'll be snitching on the cops if you do that, right?" While still pointing his rifle at my head, he spit at me. Although I would call the police if it became necessary, my first priority was to defuse the situation and prevent him from shooting me. As long as you keep the narcotics out of my place, I'll never speak about this again. That's right, bitch, you can't tell me what to do. Michael made a pistol gesture as he stated, if you go out of your way to rat me out, I'll make sure they know you're a part of this operation. In front of his pals, he had to put on an air of toughness that I couldn't help but notice. It was almost amusing to watch things unfold. It is, in fact, my intention to ensure that you and I both die in the event of my demise. I doubted Michael's intelligence or forethought, but I couldn't be positive. As a result, I had to let Michael believe that he had triumphed. In order to make Michael look more terrified, I said, "All right, Michael. He wants the public to believe that he is feared. You have my word that I will keep silent." Michael congratulates Michael on his victory. At long last, his finger was removed from the trigger. When he didn't lower the weapon, though, he swung at me. The pistol slide slammed into my face, and I felt the cold hard metal sting my left eye. I stumbled, allowing Michael to feel like he was in control at the time. It was everything I could do to maintain my fearful look and keep my rage under wraps. He screamed, "Next time, I'll kill you," before yelling at me to leave the room. I locked the door to my room and made my way to my own private space. A smile spread across my face as I held the paper towel to my injured face. That rush and pleasure from 2 years ago returned with a vengeance because I finally had a good reason, an excuse, if you will. Michael had no idea what he was getting himself into when he launched a battle. If I were you, I wouldn't put my health and well-being at danger by taking his narcotics. The fact that he couldn't win didn't occur to him at all. It's a given that I'll come out on top. For the remainder of the weekend, I remained largely solitary in my room. The clowns seemed to have taken their Saturday night substance circus elsewhere after the happenings of Saturday morning. After thinking about Michael's brief talk, I remembered one particular statement he made. This is what he said, "I'll be sure to notify them that you're part of this operation." The word operation was all it took to reveal the truth. This made it clear to me that he wasn't just a bumbling moron under the influence of drugs. He wasn't the dealer, though. It was impossible for me to allow his operation to ruin my future as an entrepreneur, no matter how dumb it was. Knowing what to do was not a problem for me. On Monday, I got up at the usual hour and headed to class. Waiting for Michael to return from the park bench across the street, I instead went to class. Even though we had class at the same time, he was consistently late for both getting out of bed and arriving for class. Then, approximately 15 minutes before class was supposed to begin, I saw his filthy brown head walk away from our apartment complex. As a result, I knew he wouldn't be home for a while. In my bathroom, I found my teal latex cleaning gloves, the ones I wore to kill Brian, and returned to my flat. When putting them on, I took extra care not to touch the palms or fingers of the gloves. After putting my fingers in the correct positions, I was ready to begin my search. I walked cautiously into Michael's room, taking care not to disturb anything. Michael was a pig, but it didn't seem to matter. Stepping over piles of laundry, I headed straight for his nightstand. Pulling on the aged gold knob revealed the noisy drawer and the gun. Although he didn't bring it to class, I'm sure he'd later kick himself for not doing so. He had a black spring-loaded knife and an extra magazine in his desk drawer. There was a picture of him and his girlfriend in the drawer as well. I believe even gangster wannabes have a soft spot in their hearts. In my opinion, I'm one of the rare persons who don't have a weak spot. There are weak points in everything. In the closet, which had one of its sliding doors already open to display hastily hung items, I made my way around his untidy bed. I noticed a smattering of jackets and hoodies covering a pile of shoe boxes in the far corner. I had a feeling those bins held what I was seeking. While moving the stinking jackets, I made sure to take note of the exact sequence in which they were placed. There were a few papers in the top orange shoe box, but they were of no importance to me. I found a rainbow glass pipe atop 3 enormous bags of marijuana in the second package, which is quite an amount, but I'm not an expert. In the meantime, I put the marijuana box away and opened the third box. Jackpot! I found a hefty bag of white powder in this package. Blow, the street name for cocaine, was clearly visible on the bag's label. A lot of cocaine looked to be on the menu here. If you were an expert, you would know that the bag alone was worth thousands of dollars. There were a dozen or so little zip-top bags resting on top of a scale next to the enormous white bag, each containing precisely pre-portioned quantities of the medication. I had long suspected that Michael's unintentional usage of the phrase operation was a sign of something more sinister. Michael was definitely making a profit. Michael appeared to be selling a lot of marijuana and cocaine, based on the evidence. This was a situation I couldn't bear to have in my home. I tossed the enormous bag to one side to see if there was anything more inside. Under the cocaine was a clear zip-up bag containing about 40 to 50 little white tablet-shaped tablets, each with a label. A Sharpie had been used to write CPT Sean on the bag. Both the letter M and the number 30 were inscribed on the tablets. My lack of experience with medications meant I had no idea what those were, but I'd do some research to find out. To construct a tentative plan, I had all of the information I required. I left after putting everything back in its proper place. This morning, I spent hours poring over stacks of heavy hardcover textbooks at my local library, sorting through pages still marked with highlighter and crusted with coffee from past students. Although a basic online search would have been quicker, the risk of being traced was too high for me to take. After squinting at the tiny print in textbook indices for hours, I finally located what I was looking for. When I found the cocaine, I suspected Michael was involved in some significant drug activity, but this information revealed something considerably more sinister. Prescription opiates like oxycodone, but Captain Sean's M30 pills aren't what they seem. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid more than 50 times more powerful than morphine, was discovered in a criminal justice and drug enforcement textbook after I discovered the small, unlabeled tablets I'd found. Oxycodone, according to this textbook, is a typical disguise for illegal drugs. Fentanyl's fatal dose is as low as 2 to 3 milligrams. A grin spread across my lips as I sat quietly in the vast library. It was high time for a change of pace. I devised a strategy. I went about my business as usual for the rest of the week, avoiding Michael's path but keeping a close eye on him. Afterwards, Michael would arrive to the flat and vanish into his room for a few minutes before re-emerging with his forest green backpack. Every 90 minutes to 2 hours, he'd make a brief appearance before disappearing back into his chamber. It was obvious that Michael was making his deliveries during this time period. His strange lover would now show up whenever he was away, because he had granted her access to his house. But I worried if Michael realized that she was snooping around in his supply. She would retire into his room for a few minutes and then come out to get a soda when she arrived at the flat. Her left nostril was almost always covered in some sort of white smear, and this was something I noticed almost every time. It didn't matter how bad her drug habits were, at least Michael could help her out. On Wednesday night, I would finally put my worries behind me. I skipped my morning class for the second time in a row. It was humanities, the most depressing course imaginable. What's the use of spending hours reading worthless poetry and listening to a bunch of snobs pretend to be sophisticated? Even though I despised it, a C was all I needed to pass. Waiting for Michael to depart was my only option. I entered his room as soon as he had left for the day and went to get the medicine box. I was really aback by how much business the youngster had been conducting. The drug shoeboxes had been depleted, but the cash box had remained almost untouched. Despite the fact that his operation was going well, he was sloppy and might easily be detected if he was permitted to continue on. That wasn't anything I wanted to get involved in. The last thing Kelly gave me before I left was a mortar and pestle, and this was the first time I got to put it to use. Crushing many of the small pills in the granite bowl with the robust stone pestle after covering my nose and mouth was a painless process. Grinder noises aren't pleasant. They sounded more like low-pitched nails on chalkboards than anything else. To this day, I've been grinding and crushing pills until they've turned into a sand-like powder. After around 20 minutes of grinding, I was satisfied with the amount I'd accumulated. Fentanyl's chalky consistency and that of cocaine were tested with gloves on. There were noticeable differences in thickness and color between the two, but I was confident that I could blend them well enough to make it undetectable. From the package, I took out the small, portion sachets of cocaine. With great care, I dumped the contents into a small cup and then added about the necessary amount of fentanyl to make a deadly dose of cocaine. Finally, I returned the now laced cocaine to its original baggie. A few more fentanyl tablets were added to the leftover cocaine, and everything was ready for use. After putting everything back in Michael's closet, I used bleach and dish soap to clean my gloves and equipment. All that was left for me to do was wait. On time, Michael returned to the flat, hastily slipping inside his room before setting out to sell his narcotics 5 minutes later with his unsightly rucksack. As expected, his girlfriend arrived shortly thereafter and proceeded to enter Michael's room. She reappeared a few minutes later, and I observed her through the gap in my door as she went to get a soda. She smiled awkwardly and twirled awkwardly toward the sofa before plopping herself down on a soft cushion. I watched as her head dipped slightly and then sprang back up again as she battled to stay awake. Her head dipped back and she closed her eyes as she succumbed to the potent opiate's deep relaxing effect. I came out of my room to check on her. With her mouth wide open and her arms stretched out to the side, she appeared to have blended with the sofa. Despite her best efforts, she was unable to stand. In order to ensure that she wouldn't wake up quickly, I prodded her a few times before placing her in a position that allowed me to maintain her airway open. Unfortunately, I was dependent on her for my own survival. As I waited for Michael to arrive, I completed the rest of my preparations swiftly yet meticulously. As I walked around the room, I was both excited and nervous at the same time. Even though I couldn't wait, I started to get nervous about the rest of my plan. I feared that I didn't know enough about drugs, and that they could be uncontrollable. In the event of the girl's death, I had a simple backup plan, but if she woke up too early, things would become sticky. In the end, I heard the jingle of keys outside my apartment, and the ensuing click of the deadbolt moving into the unlocked position. Finally, after Michael shut the front door, he turned on the lights and froze in his tracks. I was lurking behind his couch, just behind his unconscious girlfriend, with his revolver pointed at him. I held Michael's knife to her throat with my other hand. "Don't do something dumb, Michael," I quietly advised. Upon realizing the gravity of the issue, his normally confident demeanor was marred by concern, revealing one of his most vulnerable points: love. He was smitten with her. There's no doubt about it. When I saw what you had done to her, I was shocked. As if I were arresting him, Michael asked through clamped jaws, fearful and slowly raising his hands as if I were. As I pointed the gun at the woman, I pretended to be violent and said, "I knocked her out after she tried to frame me in the same manner you threatened me. So long as we both agree to go our separate ways amicably and neither of us goes to the police, I won't hurt either of you. It's pretty obvious that if any of us is arrested, the other will implicate the other. I'd want for you to have a seat now." I pulled the trigger on the gun and pointed it towards the chair across the coffee table from where his girlfriend and I were sitting. He made his way over and sat down grudgingly at my command. When Michael threatened to murder him if he harmed his girlfriend, he tightened his jaw. It was the first time since Michael's arrival that I was completely honest with him about my intentions for her safety. "Now, please have a seat, I want you to be at ease," I said. The 3 syringes of tainted cocaine that I had prepared for him were still in my hands when I pointed the knife at the girl's neck. At this point, why in the world would I take the line? Michael threw up. "Make sure you tell the cops about your drug use if they ever ask for it, just in case." "Michael, I'm trying to work out a truce so that no one is harmed." When I handed Michael the rolled-up bill that I had prepared, he took a puff and leaned over the first line. The $1 bill straw was like a vacuum, sucking up the white powder like a flower. He took a long breath and looked back up at me with a more calm face. "In order for me to find the narcotics you hid in my room, I'm going to need your help." Michael saw the need and revealed that he had indeed tucked narcotics away in some of my belongings in order to meet my demands. Wasn't that a great accomplishment for him to pull off? Michael finally decided to tell me the truth and acknowledged, "I taped marijuana in your floor vent." "Thank you for telling me that, Michael, and now, please, take another line so we can talk about what's going on." As Michael snorted the second line, I chuckled. There was a minor amount of fentanyl in the first line, but the second line had half cocaine and half fentanyl. According to my calculations, the dose was just a little bit too high. As soon as Michael snorted the second line, he shrugged and shook his head. However, I don't know how much resistance he had, but it seemed to have a strong effect on him. I said, "Now here's the idea, to get Michael's attention off of the medicine," and he agreed. As he raised his eyes to mine, I noticed his brown pupils were rapidly contracting, a sign that the medication was having an impact. "The lease is yours, and I'm moving out, so you'll be taking over the entire thing. I won't mention the drugs, and you won't mention this little, incident. Any interest?" When Michael rubbed his eyes and said, "Whatever dude, just take the knife off of her," he meant it. I could tell that he was already resisting the temptation to lower his head. The final line was perfect, "Take that and we'll shake it." He swayed ever so slightly as he continued, "I don't want a guy, something feels weird with this blow." I requested that Michael take the line so that I could let her go. Michael leaned down and inhaled the final line while shaking his head. This line had enough fentanyl to kill at least 2 people. To keep himself from collapsing, Michael put one hand on his head and the other hand on the table. His chest heaved fiercely as he struggled to breathe loudly and laboriously. I took the knife out of the girl's neck and stood up entirely to witness Michael's drug-induced stupor. As his diaphragm swelled furiously, each breath sounded like a snoring bulldog, and he leaned back on the table. Even though he tried to raise his head and meet my gaze, he was unable to do so before hitting the table hard. However, instead of his butt sitting on the chair, his face was now resting on the coffee table in front of him. After seeing Michael struggle a few more times to lift his head, I was overcome with joy. A few inches of progress each time before falling back to the table. "Next time, I'll murder you," he had said to me. I couldn't help but laugh out loud. If only he had known who he was talking to. However, I used my superiority over him to my advantage and demonstrated him to be nothing more than an obstacle in my path. His wide lips produced a cloud of white foam, which drifted across the table. Inconsistent coughing and gurgling noises were heard as a symptom of respiratory failure. I sat down and watched as Michael's body jerked involuntarily like he was having a seizure. The only thing I could hope for was that he was still conscious enough to experience the pain. All of a sudden, Michael was completely paralyzed from the waist down. While his head rested on the table, he dangled his right arm with his fingers on the carpet, swaying back and forth. To be sure he was dead, I felt his pulse. Nothing could be found. I turned to face the girl, fully oblivious to the fact that she was there. It was a good sign that her breathing had calmed down. In the event that she had perished, I would have been the one to find the bodies. My floor vent had been filled with Michael's marijuana, so I removed it and examined the rest of the vents to be safe. In order to ensure that there was no drug residue remaining in Michael's old nightstand, I removed my latex cleaning gloves and cleaned them once more. Eventually, I succumbed to exhaustion and fell asleep on my bed. This is not an easy task. Michael's girlfriend had woken up and was yelling in the living room when I woke up. Michael had been dead for several hours by the time I checked the clock, which was 12:23 a.m. Before storming out of the room, I took a big breath and acted as if I were on the verge of panicking. I observed Michael's girlfriend sobbing hysterically as she leaned over him and tried to wake him up. "I'm in a state of shock. What's going on?" I screamed, pretending to be surprised and terrified, as if I had just heard a gunshot. I don't know," she sobbed. "I think he took too much," she murmured. The words came out of her mouth while she was sobbing. He had been dead for a long time, and I'm sure she was aware of it. But I couldn't conceive that his body was still warm. "How did you get in touch with emergency services?" I begged her, trying to keep my panic in check as best I could. As tears flowed down her face, she shook her head. I figured I'd have to make the call because she wasn't well enough to do it on her own. 911? What's the matter? Help, please. What the hell is wrong with my roommate? He isn't moving. I sounded afraid and startled as I yelled into the phone. The operator had the address, thanks to me. Finally, she asked me to check her vitals after making sure that help was en route. I played along with the situation, pretending to be a frightened young man and searching for a pulse. When I arrived to the scene, Michael was eerily still and lifeless. Rigid muscles in his neck indicated that he was already in rigor mortis. In an attempt to absorb the reality of Michael's demise, Michael's girlfriend now sat at his side, gripping the cold dead hand of her beloved. I couldn't figure out why she was in such a tizzy. What did she anticipate? A white picket fence with 3 adorable children and a happy ending? As emergency responders arrived, I carefully dragged her away from the body. In an unexpected embrace, a girl who I'd never even spoken to buried her face into my shoulder. In the face of her harrowing cries, I fought back against the want to shove her away. When I encountered a dead body, I had to act like any other person who had just discovered it. Paramedics had not even attempted to resuscitate him because he was already dead. Make it look like you were disturbed up by the situation when you give your account to police. It was revealed that Michael and his girlfriend were doing narcotics and that when I asked him about it, he pointed a loaded revolver at me. When I told the police that I was afraid Michael would murder me if I reported it, I even faked tears. Since Michael's girlfriend, ironically named Kelly, witnessed the shooting, she entirely backed up my account. The fact that she was clearly comatose while I pushed Michael to overdose led her to believe that he had committed suicide by his own hand. She revealed all about the drug use and drug trading that she had witnessed. She confessed to everything, implicating her friends and herself in the incident. After Michael's cocaine was purchased by 5 more students, 2 of them died of fentanyl overdoses, but the investigation only lasted a few days. Michael was held responsible for the fatalities. In order to have the best product on campus, fentanyl and cocaine had been mixed together, and he was found to be the one to do it. Notes were taken during some contemplation about my past murder. The medications were a much more humane way to end Michael's life, and there were fewer forensic concerns as a result. You can only imagine how much blood there is in a person unless you have stabbed them multiple times. Stabbing Tim, on the other hand, was a lot more enjoyable. I've been scratching an itch ever since I looked into his eyes when I stabbed him in the heart. The one drawback for me was that the university required me to attend trauma counseling, which meant that I had to pretend to be traumatized for a lot longer than I would have liked. As expected, Stan and Kelly offered to cover the cost of pricey counseling, which I politely turned down. To avoid having to share an apartment with another person, they promptly secured a lease for a 1-bedroom apartment for me. As much as I despised them, I couldn't bear the thought of killing my entire residence. Kelly and Stan were too pliable to be tamed by anyone. I've done it again. I always come out on top. Rich's second manuscript had come to a conclusion with this final paragraph. According to this report, Rich would be considered a serial killer at the end of it all. By the end of his sophomore year, the first and second manuscripts claim that Rich had killed 5 individuals. Once again, I was able to track down true news stories about a string of fentanyl overdoses at a university that had been preserved. After the first fatality in a series of overdoses, a teenager named Michael Davenport was determined to be responsible for tainted pills. The secondary school where Tim Jones was fatally stabbed is barely 35 miles away from this university. In spite of my first doubts, I can't help but notice the level of detail in this first-person view. Assume for the moment that these documents are authentic. The majority of serial killers have a collection of memorabilia. This serial killer's prized possessions, in my opinion. Think about it.